Hey everybody, so what is the difference between the brain networks, the principles, and the guidelines of the Universal Design for Learning framework? Well, hopefully I can help describe that. So as you remember, the middle part of the brain is responsible for how we engage with learning. So that's the brain network responsible for the UDL principle, multiple means of engagement. The back part of the brain right here is responsible for the what of learning. We're using our senses to make meaning. The UDL principle that corresponds with that is multiple means of representation. And last but not least, the very front part of the brain is responsible for showing what we know, and that's the strategic network. That corresponds with the principle, multiple means of action and expression. So all of these principles make up the Universal Design for Learning framework. But sometimes it's really difficult for you and I to possibly agree on what engagement means, what representation means, and what action and expression means. So in order to help fill in those gaps and help us understand, that's where the guidelines come in. So the guidelines, a good way of thinking of the guidelines is thinking of a three-legged stool, right? So the principles, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement are the seats. In order to actually hold that principle up, you have these stool legs, which are known as the guidelines. So let's dig deep and show you what that means. So we know that the affective network is responsible for providing multiple means of engagement. That's the principle. But how do you do it? That's where these guidelines come in. So these guidelines are to show you that you can recruit interest, you can sustain effort and persistence, and provide options for self-regulation. Okay, so the back part of the brain responsible for the representation network allows us to look for ways to provide multiple means of representation. But how do we do that? So the guidelines responsible for multiple means of representation are all about perception, language and symbols, and also comprehension. All right, so this part of the brain, the strategic network, we know that corresponds with the UDL principle, multiple means of action and expression. But how do you do that? So we know that these guidelines, providing options for physical action, options for communication and expression, and also options for executive functionings, are all ways to do that. So that's the way that they are set up. Now, here's another thing for you, though. What about why are they where they're at? So the reason why they are the way they are at is because of the whole idea of systemic variability. Now, systemic variability, remember, is variability that's predictable. So the UDL principles in this first row are really teacher-led. They offer low cognitive demand and easy access. So think about that. It's pretty easy to recruit interest, and it's pretty easy to change somebody's perception by offering different medians. And physical action is very easy as well. So it's sort of like if this example of skating. So that very first row right here is when we're sort of in that naive state as a learner. So if you were trying to get on skates, for example, you would be just concentrating on getting on the skates. Notice in this brain scan here, there's so much glucose that is being burned because we're just concentrating on getting on the skates. That's why it's so important to have somebody along the way, like a teacher, to help guide us during this stage. But as we become a little bit more novel and well practiced, then what happens is we start being able to skate. Now we start holding a stick. Now we start playing the game and understanding the game of hockey. That's where this middle row comes in, where we start building our skills through more guided supports, but it's both teacher and student led. So look at these guidelines, sustaining effort and persistence, options for language and symbols, like a Frere model chart, where the teacher provides the framework and the vocabulary terms, but the student helps make meaning of that. Action, communication and expression, providing different options for communicating. Well, then we have this practice state. And so now you're not thinking about skating anymore. You're not thinking about holding a stick anymore. You're more advanced, and you can start thinking things about like defensive strategy, offensive strategy, in things like that. So that bottom row right here is where we are trying to encourage the student to become an expert learner, that internalized state where the learner is very independent and they start taking responsibility for a lot of their actions, and a lot of the things that are happening in the classroom. So self-regulation, they're learning to self-regulate their emotions. They're learning ways and tools of comprehension that work best for them. They're setting goals and evaluating those goals through executive functionings. So that's the reason why the guidelines are set up the way that they are. So just to review, just so that we're all on the same page, these are the brain networks, okay, this row. These are the UDL principles. There's 3 of them, right? Multiple means of engagement, multiple means of action expression, and multiple means of representation. Each principle has 3 guidelines to help support its implementation. And remember, they're in a specific order because these guidelines start with being teacher-led, the student and teacher working together, and then eventually the student working through their independence. This is a great way to plan for variability in the classroom, and that's how the UDL framework is set up.